Hello, everyone. This is Steve Wills, Navalist at the Center for Maritime Strategy at the Navy League of the United States, just outside Washington, D.C. You're listening to Maritime Nation, a podcast designed to dive deeply into the policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. We aim to provide you with the highest quality analysis on the most pressing maritime security challenges by joining in conversation with key experts and practitioners. This is our 10th episode of our second season of Maritime Nation, and I'm very happy today to be joined by the leader of our naval neighbor to the north, the 38th Commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, Vice Admiral Angus Topshee. Admiral, welcome to Maritime Nation this morning.
Well, thanks very much for that warm welcome.
It's excellent to have the Admiral with us. His biography here real quick. Vice Admiral Angus Topshee is the 38th Commander of the Royal Canadian Navy. His diverse academic background includes military and civilian institutions on 3 continents. He has deployed in ships around the world and has accumulated countless sea stories involving pirates, this is good, sharks, terrorists, volcanoes, whales, fires, and other things which make life at sea a true adventure, which it certainly is. The highlight of his time at sea was his far too brief command of Her Majesty's Canadian Navy ship HMCS Algonquin in 2009, 2010, and a close second, his 3 years in command of Canada's Pacific Fleet. Very exciting. His shore postings include 2 tours in the Navy Strategy Directorate as a penance for all his sea time. Oh, yes. Understand that. 3 years in command of Canadian Forces Base Halifax, a lovely, lovely place, and 2 years as the Deputy Director Strategy, Policy and Plans at NORAD in the United States Northern Command Headquarters in Colorado Springs. Another nice place, not inside the bunker, but a nice place. He is deployed to Afghanistan for all of 2011 as the director of Afghan National Police Training within the NATO training mission Afghanistan. Over the course of his career, he has somehow been involved in Arctic issues at every one of his shore postings except Afghanistan. That's quite a difference, Arctic and Afghanistan. Before taking command of the Royal Canadian Navy in May 2022, Vice Admiral Topshee had the honor and pleasure of commanding Maritime Forces Pacific and Joint Task Force Pacific located in Esquimalt, British Columbia. And of course, his career is also enabled by his fantastically supportive wife, Audrey, and 4 tremendous daughters, Amy, Zoe, Charlotte, and Iris. Admiral, thank you again. And this is going to be exciting.
Thanks very much.
No, it's always good to get everybody's biographies out there. Let's go ahead and kick off with our first question of the day. It is great to have you here in Maritime Nation. You're a long-serving Pacific officer, despite excursions to Afghanistan, whose destroyer, Algonquin, and Fleet Command were both in the Pacific. How would you describe the strategic situation there in general, and specifically, how does the Royal Canadian Navy view its role in that part of the world? We just saw where HMCS Ottawa did some operations in the Taiwan area, and I wonder if you could comment on all of this. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Indo-Pacific is an area of focus for Canada. The government released its Indo-Pacific strategy just over a year ago, and that actually has a very clear strategy that's quite realistic, I think, about the challenge of China and how we ensure that it continues to follow the rules-based international order. And then also, from the Navy's perspective, commits us to deploy at least 3 frigates a year into the Indo-Asia Pacific, which is a challenge on a force where we only have 12 frigates. So the bulk of our force is now heading into that region. It is an interesting region. It's very large. It's one of the things that I try and explain to most Canadians, that we tend to be a very Atlantic-focused country. All of our maps default to having the North Atlantic at the center, and the Pacific's that thing that falls off the left-hand edge of the map, and you don't really think about it. But Canada is very much a Pacific nation. We're members of the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, and we feel passionately about the need to be involved and be in that region. So much of the world's GDP is derived from it. The large part of the world's population is in Asia, and so we want to make sure that we are a part of understanding the region and contributing to sustaining that rules-based international order.
That's excellent. Now, we were talking before this started, what the United States calls freedom of navigation operations is called something else by the Royal Canadian Navy. I wonder if you could explain to us how you describe those kind of operations.
Yeah, we've always, perhaps it's because there's a history of freedom of navigation operations being conducted in Canadian waters that we've never really liked the term fawn ops. And so we tend to regard it as simply as, no, it's just a ship exercising its normal rites of passage.
Absolutely.
And we don't try and make them anything more than they actually are. And so our philosophy is quite simple. If we're going from point A to point B, then we will pass through whatever international straits and international waters make the most sense to do so. And we want to make sure that all the nations of the world continue to comply with the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea.
Absolutely.
So we think it's important to be able to demonstrate that. And we're really pleased at the close support we've had with 7th Fleet. And, it's always nice in that part of the world to operate in company with a close ally.
Yes, absolutely, and fully agree with that. The Pacific also touches the Arctic. Now, we were talking about the Arctic here for a minute.
And the Canadian Arctic covers 40% of Canada's territory. It is home to more than 200,000 Canadian inhabitants. Royal Canadian Navy and, of course, the Canadian Coast Guard as well are regular Arctic operators, very experienced there in the light of climate change and the potential for even more access to the Arctic from outsiders. And we've seen this happen frequently with, inexperienced boaters getting up there and then becoming lost and having to be, rescued and so forth. How does the Royal Canadian Navy view the strategic situation up there in the Arctic, especially in light of new raw material access, greater shipping? You were talking earlier about actually doing the Northwest Passage, which, mariners had wanted to do from time immemorial and couldn't do. And of course, recreational Arctic access, not to mention, of course, some returning Russian militarization up there that we've seen from the NATO side, and of course, the presence of our Chinese friends. So I wonder if you could talk sort of in general about those things in the Arctic.
Yeah, certainly. The Arctic is a passion of mine. I've been interested and involved in the Arctic for virtually my entire career. And it's wonderful to see the Royal Canadian Navy has now got a ship in the Harry DeWolf class that is designed to operate in that environment. And so, to prove that, yes, Harry DeWolf transited the Northwest Passage in 2021.
So cool.
The Canadian Arctic is interesting. Of the 8 Arctic nations, ours is the most sparsely populated. So I enjoyed you said that, the way you said 200,000 Canadians made it sound as though it's a lot. I tend to look at it the other way as with only 200,000.
Oh, with Canadians. Only 2. Okay.
Because it is a vast expanse. The size of the Canadian Arctic is something that even Canadians don't fully appreciate. And what I've taken to explain to people is that if you sail out of our base in Halifax up to a refueling hub in Nanisivik on Baffin Island, that trip is actually longer than crossing the entire Atlantic Ocean to Portsmouth or into the Mediterranean. And likewise, if you're from sailing out of Esquimalt up into the Beaufort Sea, that will take you farther if you go right into the Northwest Passage than going all the way across the Pacific to Tokyo.
Oh my goodness, that is significant.
Yeah, so and there is not a lot up there, and so it is a very sparsely populated region. We regard it as an expeditionary theater because those 200,000 Canadians up there, they depend upon the resources that they're able to fly in the winter, barge up in the summer. We can't go in there like we would, we would pull into Hawaii and, go down and sort of let's get lots of more fruit, vegetables, consumables and all that stuff. We can't go up into the north and expect to be resupplied up there. We have to bring anything we need up with us. And so that's why we've deliberately built the Harry DeWolf class to be a very resilient, very long-legged. It could sail all the way from Halifax through the Northwest Passage to Esquimalt on a single tank of gas.
Oh, wow.
To do.
Very, very good.
Captain would be a bit nervous upon arrival because that would really be pushing the limits of that. But, there's a number of places to refuel along the way outside of the Arctic. And so we're really pleased with the legs of that ship. It can break over 3 feet of ice. In fact, the ice capability of the ship has exceeded our expectations.
Wow.
It's got some fantastic connectors, boats and landing craft and a helicopter that allow it to really integrate and connect in that. And we see the Arctic as a true littoral environment, one where it's, so the presence of the ship is important, but it's only in the context of the greater effort up there. And so it's not just a whole of government effort, it's a whole of industry, whole of society thing, because one of the things we learned early on is building infrastructure in the north, incredibly expensive and difficult. Especially now with climate change making permafrost less predictable, even more difficult to build upon. And so where we can, we leverage into our industry partners up there. We discovered that, there are some, because of the resources you mentioned, some major, mine sites and other things that that offer us potential hubs. And so we look at a lot of dual use facilities. So why would we build something solely for ourselves when we can leverage what exists for industry? And ideally, wherever we do want to do something, we want to make sure it works for the needs of the local community as well. So it's a different part of the world to operate in.
Absolutely. No, it's quite fascinating. We tend to think of it in terms of, exploration and people with, dog sled teams or early ships trying to get up there. But now it's become a much more regular sort of place to operate.
It has. But I think we sometimes overestimate how much the Northwest Passage will be a shipping route. Just because of the way the ice moves around the Arctic gyre, it will tend to accumulate on the western side of the Canadian archipelago. There will be very difficult and complicated ice conditions there for a long time. And no matter what, even if the Arctic ice cap melts in the summer, there will still be a cold and very frozen north in the winter times. So it's not like it's going to be a year-round shipping route. The Canadian North is also only about 10% of it is charted to modern standards. It's a winding and unpredictable passage. And so I think the transpolar route is actually the one that offers the most promise. Because it is the most direct route across the pole. And then the Russians also have their Northern Sea route, which they've opened up and is a simpler route on a number of levels. I mean, working with the Russians, a complication. But you can probably find something in between those two that I think is the most likely path. What we see in the Northwest Passage is, as you say, it's adventurers, it's travel, it's people going into the Canadian Arctic as a destination, either to drop off supplies, to exploit the iron ore resources of the Mary River Mine and Baffin Island, that type of stuff. The Northwest Territories also is one of the world's largest reserves of diamonds, of all things.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, you learn something new every day. I did not know that about the Northwest Territories. That's pretty cool. Now, you had mentioned Harry DeWolf, and we talked a little bit about different classes of ships before this. And the Royal Canadian Navy, like so many other Western and other navies, faces some aging force structure in terms of surface ships and major surface combatants. Can you tell our listeners how Canada plans to perhaps eventually replace both the Halifax-class frigates and then, of course, the Victoria-class submarines as well, and what new platforms such as Uncrewed Systems might figure into your force structure?
Absolutely, yeah. So we're in the midst of the largest recapitalization of the Canadian Navy in peacetime.
Oh, wow.
So we are right now working to replace our Halifax-class frigates. There's 12 of those, plus the 4 air defense destroyers that we've already retired, with a single class of 15 Canadian surface combatants. These will be real traditional destroyers, capable of all aspects of warfare, able to go into the front line of battle. But if you want real combat power, you want to aggregate them into a squadron of 3, 4, or 5 of them, and they will deliver a real punch for Canada. But knowing we hadn't built ships for a long time, the government decided to embark about 10 years ago on a national shipbuilding strategy. So deliberately, we chose to build the non-combatant vessels first. So the Harry DeWolf class was built in a brand new shipyard in Halifax. We've taken delivery of the first 4 of the 6 that will come to the Navy.
Very nice.
Then they'll be building 2 for the Coast Guard.
Oh, okay.
And then after that shipyard has now, we can see the gains in efficiency as they've delivered, number 4 ahead of schedule.
Good.
So they'll be ready to build the much more complex Canadian surface combatant, which will be we think it'll come in somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 tons. And so a great capability for the Canadian Navy. On the West Coast, we are building joint support ships, so 2 tankers. So again, that's a shipyard that hadn't done a lot of major shipbuilding. And so the first of those 2 joint support ships, HMCS Protector, is the longest ship ever built in Canada at 173.3 meters.
Oh, wow.
Not the largest, because we've built some things that have a higher displacement, but certainly long enough that it is complicated to try and figure out how they're going to launch that ship, because it's longer than the barge they traditionally use. But the engineers assure me that they've got a plan.
Wonderful.
And then after that, we are embarking upon a plan to replace our 4 Victoria-class submarines. And so one of the interesting things about subs in Canada is that the reason we have 4 Victoria-class is because at the time we made the decision to replace our old Oberon submarines, it was desperately close to retirement of those submarines, and we just needed to buy something. And so we bought the only submarine available on the market at the time, the old British Upholder class. The reason we have 4 Victoria is because there were only 4 Upholder to buy.
Got it.
The actual requirement for Canadian submarines is a number greater than that. Ideally to protect 3 oceans. And if you can do, you really always, in Navy terms, you want to have 4 of something if you want 1 available guaranteed at any time. So to protect all 3 oceans, we're looking at a class of about 12, but the ultimate decision is governments to decide what's the right number for Canada. Because of course, submarines are expensive things.
They are.
These will be diesel electric, though. And so we have explored the option of nuclear-powered submarines in the past twice, once in the 1960s, once in the 1980s. And I think, it's a recognition that while that submarine might make sense from a requirements and a capability point of view, right now it would take too long for us to deliver. We don't have that much time to wait. So we're going to buy a diesel electric submarine. We're not closing off any options or insisting on anything down the road. What we want to do is just make sure that we've got a submarine capability for Canada that will protect our three oceans going forward.
That certainly makes sense. I'd done some reading in advance on the decision in the late 1980s regarding nuclear power, and of course we're going to continue to watch as the AUKUS process develops over time, and who knows what is possible in the future. But thank you. 12 submarines is a good.
12 submarines we think would meet the requirement. Could we do it with less? Absolutely. There was always trade-offs, and so we will work with government to arrive at the right option for Canada.
Absolutely. Okay, sir. So one of the other new technologies out there that's been discussed by many navies is uncrewed systems, and maybe you can tell us for a bit about how the Royal Canadian Navy is integrating uncrewed systems into operations.
Yeah, absolutely. So we I get asked, are we sure we should be building such a large ship as a Canadian surface combatant? Isn't the future going to be something that doesn't have a crew on board it, that's smaller and goes other places? And our feeling is that no, there's always going to be a need for that hub, that center of power. For us, it'll be a destroyer. For the U.S. Navy, it's an aircraft carrier, amphibious ship, and all of the other things. We know that the crewed ship will still be relevant. But I think that going forward, the ability of that ship to employ a range of sensors in air, on the water, under the water is going to be really important. One of the things that's driving us there is that there's only going to be a 24-cell Mark 21 VLS in the Canadian Surface Combatant.
Got it. Okay.
And we would, as we look at the threats and the challenges that we face in the future, we know that's not enough missiles for what we need to be able to do. It's not all of the air defense capacity of the ship. It will also have some 24 shorter range missiles. But, to really make sure we're fit for the fight, we'd want to have more. The initial thought was, okay, well, we'll just have to find a way to make the ship bigger. That would delay the project. It would really add to the engineering complexity, probably result in a slower ship. The other option is, why wouldn't we just build a series of optionally crewed or uncrewed, entirely uncrewed vessels that are effectively a Mark 41?
A floating magazine.
A series of them, because what it does then is, because it's got weapons, it becomes a target that the adversary has to keep in mind.
Yes.
It's not just another sensor system that they can avoid or decoy. It's something that will actually cause them harm if, in a fight, so they have to take it out. It complicates the picture, so it's a number of other things in the battle space. So as someone's trying to sort through the picture and figure out what's the ship, what's the hub of the thing that I have to hit, you've got all these other targets, complications. It's additional sensors and nodes in this web of sensors that we want to make sure that we've got as thorough domain awareness as we can. Comms relays and a series of other things. And so we think that's one of the ways that we would look at using uncrewed vessels. So taking honestly a deficiency in the design of the ship, not enough cells, turning it into an opportunity of, well, let's create these other ships that will do that. So we're not at the point yet where we're going to actually build those because we want to deliver the ship first.
Sure.
And then I go through the process of figuring out what would these adjunct magazines, for lack of a better word, look like. We're also working hard on all sorts of different underwater systems and sensors. We know that our next submarine will be able to deploy a series of autonomous vehicles. For example, we've got the polar ice cap up in Canada.
Yes.
You can send a submarine under the ice. It's an environment in which the submarine sensors are degraded considerably.
Yes.
Often the better way to go, to be honest, is why wouldn't we send something uncrewed under the ice, have it come back and let us know what's going on down there. So we know that there's a real value in autonomous sensors. The other one, of course, is when you've got to patrol a coastline as long as ours. It's a pretty boring task for a group of sailors to do, but a perfect thing for a glider and for other things to do. So we're looking at how would we build that into a network of ideally fixed and unfixed, so mobile sensors. That would really give us a true understanding of what's happening in and around Canadian waters.
That would be an impressive capability. As we know, many navies are moving toward this idea of sort of a loyal wingman, where uncrewed systems operate in conjunction with crewed systems to create those effects that you talked about. It always reminds me of that 1980s video game Missile Command, where if you lose one of your missile bases, then that's okay. You can continue on with your main base then. And the other thing you said too, sir, about the vast spaces, especially the Canadian Arctic, having those uncrewed systems up there to create situational awareness and true maritime domain awareness there is going to be vital. I think the other challenge too, and maybe you can talk about this, many people think that having uncrewed systems means that it's just less people, but actually you still need people to maintain the uncrewed systems and keep them going. So
that's exactly it. And I think when I say we've also contemplated things like optionally crewed systems. So
yes,
sometimes it's a lot easier to have a crew, the capacity to put a crew onto a vessel for a period of time. But then if you are going into a combat zone or something else, or if you're going to put it into particular risk, the ability to remove that crew at certain moments. So we're looking at all sorts of different things that allow it. And then also we have to make sure the law of the sea reflects all of that. Because in theory, if you abandon a ship upon the seas, it's eligible to be salvaged by anyone else, which is not something we necessarily want to happen to all of these platforms. And so making sure that the legal status of these keeps up, with what systems can do these days is another factor.
Excellent. Thank you. So, sir, another question in the international realm is the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. Some people have again recommended that the United States, who generally abides by all the elements of the convention but has not fully ratified this, get involved in this. What's been Canada's experience over time with UNCLOS, goods, bads, challenges, et cetera, and any recommendations you'd have for the United States?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the last one first, because I think your last several chiefs of naval operations and commandants of the Coast Guard have recommended that the US Senate ratify the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. So I would say that they're right, and ideally that would happen. But I also recognize the challenge of politics down here. So the fact the US complies with it in practice is obviously helpful. For Canada, it's been very beneficial. We're really proud of the work that went into negotiating UNCLOS back in the 1980s. The big thing for Canada was the recognition of the special status of Arctic waters under Article 234, which gives nations with ice-covered waters the rights to make regulations to protect those waters. And that was actually enshrining into international law something that Canada had done in 1970. In 1970, which is the Arctic Water Pollution Prevention Act, because we recognize the danger of an oil spill or something else in the pristine conditions of the Arctic, and so we set a series of regulations that said, if you're going to operate in the Arctic, that's fine, but you have to comply with the standards that make sure that you can do so safely, having an ice pilot on board, having a properly regulated and maintained ship, complying with the appropriate ice codes, and all of that. So that's all now in a Canadian Transport Canada Act, but that's protected by UNCLOS under Article 234. So that was something that we made sure was in that agreement. So we're proud of that achievement. The other thing we see is that, it was negotiated in the 1980s, signed in the 1982, eventually ratified by enough nations in the 1990s, it came into force. I see that there are a number of nations, China among them, that have sort of said, perhaps this doesn't, it's not the right law anymore. We've seen at times China taking actions that make it look as though they're trying to expand territorial water status out to the end of the contiguous zone at 24 miles. I worry that there's a number of nations that make excessive maritime claims. So it's possible that at some point there's going to be this push to renegotiate it. I think we need to be very cautious about that. This has become a fundamental part of international law. It's an important principle that allows all navies to understand where is it permissible to operate, where is it not, what are the coastal protections. The big thing it introduced was the idea of an exclusive economic zone at the 200 nautical miles, where nations now have the right to control the fish stocks, the living resources of that area. I think that's a real positive. We do a lot of work with navies around the world and nations to make sure that their coast guards and navies are able to enforce those standards. And so I think it's created this fundamental baseline of how do we understand and regulate the waters. And, as my friends in Norway tell me all the time, that some of the provisions that it has given have allowed them to go through some tough negotiations with the Russians over maritime boundaries. And so there's a lot that's really good in there. But I think in the West, we've got to, keep in mind, there are some nations who don't feel as though they were included in the process of negotiating, or that it doesn't represent their interests. And so there is probably going to be a push to say, do we need to reopen aspects of this? Do we want to expand it? And I think we should understand that desire, but undertake it with great caution.
Those are all excellent points. And you mentioned the fishing component as well. Illegal, unreported, unregulated I sometimes turn those last two U's around, is certainly an important issue, and UNCLOS helps to set some boundaries there then to manage that.
Yeah, absolutely. In the Canada's new Indo-Pacific strategy, we also recognize the importance of fisheries. And so in addition to sort of directing me to deploy 3 frigates in the area, it also provides money to our Department of Fisheries and Oceans to go and assist nations of the Indian and Pacific Oceans in managing their fisheries, understanding how to build a sustainable fishery, something that in Canada, it took us a couple of tries to figure out as we, as the cod stocks off the coast of Newfoundland disappeared, and we're like, okay, so creating and we're watching with great interest and potentially some concern about, fish migration, fish stock migration up into the Arctic.
Yes.
There is a moratorium on fishing in the high seas areas of the Arctic at the moment, but my question has always been, was that a reflection of the fact that we couldn't do it at the time that all the nations agreed to that? Or is it a genuine sort of recognition that this isn't something we'd necessarily want to exploit a resource in that area? So I'm mindful of the possibility that, of course, international law, can seem static and unmoving, but the reality is it doesn't. It changes and updates and conditions change. And so we need to be conscious constantly of what is changing, what new factors are going to take into this, and what might other nations want to do. And what's the Canadian interest in all of that? And how do we work with allies and partners to make sure that we continue to have that rules-based international order that gives us a framework for, nations are going to disagree. As long as we have a framework for how we're going to resolve that without going to war, there's a pretty good chance we can stay at peace. And so that's why we're so focused on the rules-based international order.
Absolutely. And UNCLOS helps support that. So
it is. It's one of the fundamental underpinnings. So really pleased to see it in place. And like I said, if the U.S. would ratify it, it certainly lends credence to the arguments that everybody should follow it.
We certainly would think so as well. All right, moving to a more lighter conversation subject away from nuclear submarines. Admiral, your bio says you're known for your sea stories. And of course, we noted pirates, sharks, terrorists, volcanoes, whales, fires, very much sort of the stuff of seagoing adventure. Can you tell our listeners, or especially good stories? Of course, all those topics sound good to us.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's always interesting to see what you encounter on the seas. There's unexpected moments at all sorts of times. And so the one I think I remember most is we had just finished circumnavigating Africa with a NATO squadron, and we were heading into the Red Sea. And just as we were sort of approaching the Bab el-Mandeb, we got word from basically NORAD. Which at the time I hadn't worked there yet, didn't really appreciate what they did, but they'd said, hey, our overhead persistent infrared sensors have picked up something that's of significance about 6 hours ahead of you. You might want to be aware of it. It's sort of consistent with the explosion of a large magazine or some other activity. And we're like, oh my God, that doesn't sound good. And so we quickly gathered the team and took a look at this and realized, okay, there's a small island off the coast of Yemen in about that location. What's going on? We had no idea, and we had the sense of, okay, well, we'll head towards it and we'll see what's going on. And one of the officers on board said, well, it says here that there's potential volcanic activity. Maybe it's a volcano. And the CO was he's like, God, no, there's no way. There are no volcanoes in the Red Sea. That's ridiculous. Just get out of here.
Exactly.
And so lo and behold, 5 hours later, the bridge calls down and says, I think I see lava coming in. And sure enough, there was a small island in the Red Sea that was erupting.
Oh my goodness.
And on that island had been about 29 Yemeni soldiers.
Oh my goodness.
Who mid-afternoon, all of a sudden this eruption happens and they have no idea what's going on. And of course, the island is now exploding, lava flowing down. So they all just head to the sea and rush into the water to save themselves. Yemeni Coast Guard was able to pick up about 21 of them before it got dark. And they were missing another 8. And so this NATO task group, we came up and we arrived there late at night. It was dark, and worked with the Yemen. And the Yemen said, yes, please, can you help us find these remaining soldiers? So we searched through the night. It was fascinating. I wound up in a small boat, trying to get close to shore just to see, because we figured some of them might swim back. Fascinating environment. I never thought I'd be that close to an active volcano. And just kept searching. No luck in the morning. We spotted a couple of bodies. So unfortunately recovered a few of those, and some of the other task group ships did the same thing. And, around 10 or 11 in the morning, we said, it's been a long time. It's not likely anyone's still alive. So, and the Yemeni Coast Guard was like, yeah, look, we really appreciate it. Thank you very much for your assistance, but you might as well head on your way. And ironically, just as we made the decision to do that, one of our lookouts spotted something in the water. And it was this 18-year-old Yemeni Private Ahmed, who had spent 22 hours swimming.
Oh my goodness.
He is not a swimmer. We talked to him through a translator later, and it was just, he had this incredible will to live. And the U.S. ship we were with spotted one of his friends near the same location. And, you know, it was amazing to see the smiles on sailors' faces as we realized that here it is. We'd made a difference. We'd saved someone's life. We unfortunately hadn't been able to help the others. But it taught us a number of things, you know, and the importance of making sure that you sustain the search for as long as possible, and you really make sure you understand what are the limits of human endurance. And the other thing it taught me too was, you know, Private Ahmed survived because of his will to live, and something kept him going through all of that. And so I think it's really important as we look nowadays is how do we make sure that we inspire that same sense of desire to keep fighting, to keep going in our sailors. And so how do we build that component of what we would call a spiritual wellness for anything else? What is that thing that keeps you going when everything seems against you and just that fight to survive? We want to inspire that in our sailors. And this was a really interesting lesson of the importance of that because it saved Private Ahmed's life.
That is an amazing story. And certainly it does say something about how you can take any of these kind of incidents like this and turn it into a training opportunity, a learning opportunity for your own force. And that is truly amazing. I've never heard of anybody encountering an active erupting volcano. That's like out of a book or...
Well, it was one of those things where you'd think I'd remember those lessons because I was caught by surprise by the pandemic as well. It's like, you know, so it's... you know, volcanoes can happen. You never know what's going to go in. So part of the wonderful thing about navies is just the inherent readiness that we have by the ability to take ships to sea. And so that's part of the message I often give to government, as I said, you know, the ability to deploy ships into a region means that if something happens, you will have the Canadian capacity to go there and at least contribute to the response and help save Canadians who might be caught up in that region or contribute to the collective response.
Absolutely. You can be shooting 1 minute and immediately turn around and be delivering humanitarian relief supplies the next. It's not like an armored division can't make a goodwill visit to a place, you know.
So
but
it tends to be a very intimidating type of visit.
It's amazing. It's just amazing what vessels can do. And navies have been doing this, you know, forever and a day. And it's an amazing capability. That is a cool story. I will carry that with me for a while. Now, as always on Maritime Nation, we like to introduce an interesting naval term and unpack its significance. And in honor of our guest today, we thought we'd pick an interesting Canadian term that seemed to resonate with us. And today's naval term is bloggins, that comes to us from the Royal Canadian Navy, whose own heritage is very unique because it comes from, like the United States Navy, its own United Kingdom Royal Navy roots, but its own North American and unique experiences that mold its personnel. But, sir, as I understand it, the term bloggins, when applied to a sailor, is sort of what U.S. Navy personnel mean when they speak of a common sailor, lowest common denominator sailor issue. But I wonder if you could explain more what that one is.
Yeah, it always goes by whenever you're trying to explain a policy or what's it going to mean. You're looking for that generic sailor to reference in it, and for us, it's always leading seaman or now sailor first class bloggins.
Sailor first class
bloggins, bloggins this, bloggins that. And so what would bloggins do? It's just our term for a generic rather than a Smith or something else. Because there isn't anyone, as far as I know, in the Navy named Bloggins. If that ever happened, that would probably be a real problem, because it's our generic for imagine Sailor X as Bloggins.
I think the U.S. equivalent to that has been something like Seaman Timmy or Seaman Tammy. Yeah. If Seaman Timmy or Seaman Tammy could get it, then anybody could potentially understand it. All right. Well, folks, that's a wrap. I want to thank Admiral Angus Topshee very much for joining us today and sharing your unique insights. I would also very much like to thank our listeners for joining us each month here. If you have not heard our previous episode, you can always catch up with Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts. Episodes and all content described here can be found on our new website, www.centerformaritimestrategy.org. And stay tuned for our next episode of Maritime Nation. Thank you.